Welcome to our series of lectures on the learning process. Who amongst us is not familiar with this word called learning? But let us listen to what Doris Lessing has to say about what learning is all about. She says, that is what learning is. You suddenly understand something you have understood all your life, but in a new way. Many psychologists would not completely agree with what Doris Lessing has defined as learning. It is a word that is familiar to all of us, and to most people, learning implies acquiring new knowledge and skills, becoming better in a particular domain, or simply becoming wiser. Think of the numerous ways in which you yourself have grown by learning skills such as singing, playing a musical instrument, riding a bicycle, or driving a car. We can also learn more sophisticated skills such as using a computer or learning to write computer programs. As a small mental exercise, try to recall when and how you learned to read and write, to add and subtract, to multiply and divide, to solve puzzles, or to follow rules at home or at school. One can easily guess that the answers to these questions will not come easily, because most of us know that we have learned all these skills or actions, but we cannot tell easily when and how that learning actually took place. Can you describe how you learned the route from your school to home when your family moved to a new city? This is another kind of learning, often referred to as wayfinding, and we will soon see that psychologists have proposed special theories for explaining and understanding how routes or ways are learned. The list of what we learn is endless. Learning, in fact, is an endless process. It would be no exaggeration to say that learning takes place throughout our lives. Education is only one domain in which learning as well as teaching are primary features. But learning takes place constantly in all other walks of life as well. However, not all learning takes place with awareness, nor is the process exactly the same in the case of various forms of learning. In other words, we learn many things, but many of them are learned without us as learners being actually conscious or aware of the fact that we are learning. On the other hand, there could be many other examples of learning that one indulges in very actively and with awareness. The question is, if learning is such a common process and is so familiar to us, why do we need to study it formally as a psychological process? The answer is, as in the case of many other processes, we need to understand exactly how learning takes place, the similarities and differences between various kinds of learning, and the specific elements or components that may facilitate or inhibit learning. Let us take a look at some definitions of learning that have been given by psychologists. Psychologists define learning in slightly different ways. A. Learning refers to any process through which experience at one time can alter an individual's behavior at a future time. This definition has been given by a writer called Peter Gray. What his definition implies is that we can learn something at one point in time and not know that such learning has taken place, but the effects of this learning become evident at a future time when a similar situation comes up and requires the kind of learning that was done at the earlier point in time. A more general definition can be seen in B. Learning is a process that results in a relatively consistent change in behavior or behavior potential and is based on experience. This definition can be called a more general or broad definition mainly because it incorporates the main characteristics of what psychologists call the process of learning. We will now look at the major characteristics of the learning process as psychologists see it. First, learning always involves a change. This change could be in behavior or behavior potential, that is, the capacity to behave in a particular way, and or in cognition. However, not every change indicates that actual learning has taken place. Secondly, in learning, there has to be a relatively consistent change, that is, a change that remains with the individual for a long time. Now, the question is this relatively consistent change a permanent change? The answer that many people would give to this question is that the permanence of the change cannot actually be verified in all instances. So, it is safer to say that learning results in a relatively permanent change in the sense that whatever action or behavior or cognition changes as a result of learning is not reversible. Thirdly, learning is the result of experience. Experience here can be taken to mean exposure to specific information or to certain environmental conditions. Fourth, changes due to learning are progressive. That is, they take the organism forward and help the individual to adapt to situations. Here, one must point out that this aspect may be at least slightly debated. For instance, one can see many individuals learning behavior that is certainly not favorable or desirable in the sense of taking the individual forward, and yet these changes would be classified under learning. Fifthly, learning has to be distinguished from something called maturation and development. These two concepts are very closely linked. Maturation and development also bring about relatively permanent changes that are progressive in nature. But these changes are based on biological factors rather than on experience or environmental conditions. In this sense, then, such changes that result from maturation cannot be said to be the result of learning. Sixth, learning is also to be distinguished from changes in behavior that show reduced or increased responding under specific circumstances, as is the case in two processes, namely habituation and sensitization. Habituation is the reduced responding to repeated presentation of a stimulus. This may be short-term or long-term. Sensitization, on the other hand, refers to increased responding to repeated presentation of the stimulus and is typically a short-term change. In both cases, the difference between learning and these forms of changes in behavior are adaptive responses, which may appear to be similar to learning, but because they are non-associative, they would be called dissimilar to learning. There could, of course, be examples of relatively permanent changes in behavior that combine maturation and development and experience. For instance, skills such as riding a bicycle assume a certain level of maturation and development. However, once that level of development is reached, one cannot assume that individuals will necessarily be able to ride a bicycle without any practice or exposure. So, to the extent that they have to go through the learning process of riding a bicycle, one can classify this kind of skill under learning that is based on maturation. We turn our attention now to the major theories of learning. Several theories have been proposed in this area with the aim of describing how learning takes place. The theories also aim at explaining the process so that predictions can be made given that we understand the conditions under which certain forms of learning take place. One can admit various kinds of classifications of these learning theories, but a commonly accepted classification of these theories is as given below. A. SR or stimulus response theories. B. Cognitive theories. C. Social learning theories. And D. Constructivist theory. The fourth category, namely the constructivist theory, is probably the least familiar to students and teachers of learning. So, we will be taking a brief look at this last theory as well. But let us begin with the first category of theories that are probably the most familiar to anyone who studies this topic in psychology. These are referred to as stimulus response theories because all of the theories in this category emphasize the fact that the learning process is basically based on an association or connection between specific stimuli and specific responses. The nature of the association or connection, however, varies according to the theories that have been listed here. We will be describing these 5 stimulus response theories. Contiguity-based theory proposed by Guthrie, trial and error learning theory proposed by Thorndike, classical conditioning theory proposed by Pavlov, operant conditioning theory proposed by Skinner, and drive reduction theory proposed by Hull. We begin with the first stimulus response theory proposed by Edwin Guthrie. This is said to be a simple SR theory which has not been publicized very much. According to students of Guthrie, particularly one called Virginia Works, Guthrie's theory has 3 major postulates. A. The principle of association, based primarily on stimulus response contiguity. B. The principle of postreamity, which means that the last response in the series of associated responses will be shown in learning. And C. The principle of response probability. That response will be learned which is associated with the largest proportion of stimuli. The idea of contiguity basically means that the time relationship or the closeness of the association between the stimulus and the response plays an important role in learning. In addition to these 3 postulates, Guthrie's theory had some other features, namely a distinction between what Guthrie called movements and what he called acts. In his view, it was movements that are learned and expressed in the form of observable acts. So the observed response that the organism comes out with at the end of the learning process is actually an expression in the form of acts, which are based on movements that are simply muscular or neurophysiological responses. A second feature is that Guthrie did not give importance to reinforcement or its equivalent, namely reward or punishment. We will soon see that many of the stimulus response theories emphasize the idea of reinforcement or strengthening of a learned response, but that element was not emphasized in Guthrie's theory. Thirdly, repetition of a response over trials as a basis of learning as such was also not considered by Guthrie to be an important component of the SR learning process. Guthrie provided evidence for these postulates and the other features and ideas through animal experiments, very similar, for instance, to the kind of experiments conducted by another SR theorist known as Thorndike. For example, Guthrie is also known to have conducted experiments placing a cat in a puzzle box. We move on to the second SR theory, that proposed by Edward Thorndike, more famous as trial and error learning. Thorndike proposed a theory of learning based on SR connections or associations, very much as Guthrie did. However, the basis of this association was said to be quite different. According to Thorndike, learning takes place by repeatedly performing specific responses to specific stimuli over several trials, that is, over several repetitions of the stimulus response association. This Thorndike referred to as the law of exercise. A second point that was emphasized by Thorndike was that during these repetitions over several trials, the correct responses are stamped in, to use Thorndike's own phrase, and the incorrect responses or errors are stamped out. That essentially implied that the correct responses were made part of the neurophysiological system, and the incorrect responses were not given such a place. Next, the process of stamping in of correct responses and stamping out of incorrect responses is gradual and not sudden. Another point that was emphasized was that stamping in of correct responses is based on reward on performing such responses. This Thorndike called the law of effect. That is, responses that lead to satisfaction are retained, and those that do not lead to satisfaction are allowed to leave the system. The theory of trial and error learning is also referred to as instrumental learning, because in this form of learning, the reward comes only after the correct response is made by the learner. The major principles of Thorndike's theory were shown with the help of animal experiments, as was the case with Guthrie's theory, and as we will see very quickly, with also the other theorists that fall under the category of SR theories. The kind of experiments that Thorndike was famous for was conducted with a cat in a puzzle box. Here is a brief description of what Thorndike did in his experiment. A hungry cat was placed inside the puzzle box, which was a simple cage-like structure. The door of the puzzle box could be opened by operating a lever, which was in the form of a latch or even a simple rope fixed on the door. Outside the puzzle box, some food was placed. The response that was to be learned by the cat was opening of the door by operating the lever, getting out of the puzzle box and eating the food. Here is a diagram of Thorndike's puzzle box. The schematic diagram that is shown on this slide shows the gradual decline in errors over trials, and this graph would be something similar to what is shown here. One can see therefore that the number of errors declines slowly with each trial. Essentially, what happened in Thorndike's experiment was that on the very first trial, when the cat was placed in the puzzle box, the cat would indulge in exploratory behavior because this situation was a new one for the animal. In trying to get out of that puzzle box, the cat would initially very accidentally open the door by operating the lever or the latch. Once it got out of the cage, it would eat the food, that is the reward, but would be immediately placed back in the cage. The question is, what can we expect on the next trial? Quite correctly and quite expectedly, one would say that the cat's behavior would now be more focused in and around the door where the cat had operated the latch or the lever, and so on every trial. Ultimately, there would be a situation where when the cat is placed inside the puzzle box, the first thing that it would do is to go towards the door, open the latch and get out of the puzzle box. At this stage, it would be said that the learning process based on trial and error was complete. Several questions, however, were still raised with reference to Thorndike's theory, as was also the case with Guthrie's theory. In the case of Thorndike's theory, the specific questions that came up were as follows. Was response learning based on associations as proposed by Thorndike really the kind of association that Thorndike described, or could it be explained better in terms on expectation of a reward? If it is the latter, that is, if the explanation is better given in terms of expectation, then the term trial and error and the description of this theory as being based on stimulus-response association would probably not be completely correct. A second question that could be raised is with reference to the idea of satisfaction. How was satisfaction actually defined? Is there an element of circularity in the idea of satisfaction being the basis of what Thorndike called effect? One can see that the fact that there was satisfaction was noted by seeing that the cat performed that particular response more frequently. On the other hand, the answer once again would be that the satisfaction is obtained because the reward is forthcoming. Hence, there is a circularity in this particular point. We will see in the case of Skinner's theory that a similar circular element exists in the concept of what Skinner called reinforcement. A third issue that can be raised with reference to Thorndike's theory is the role of punishment. In general, Thorndike would have agreed that reward and punishment play a role in learning based on trial and error. However, it is not very clear how punishment as such functions in the context of trial and error learning as proposed by Thorndike. Is punishment the same as the absence of reward, or is it something different? If it is something different, how can punishment be defined? There were several other questions that were not clearly answered. We move on to the third form of SR learning called classical conditioning, which was proposed by a Russian physiologist by the name of Ivan Pavlov. Many people know Pavlov as a Nobel Prize winner who was given this award for his work on the functioning of salivary glands in dogs. But for psychologists, The part of Pavlov's research that is more meaningful is that which later got the name classical conditioning. The whole idea of conditioning, in fact, is a special kind of associative learning that combines stimulus with response. In this form of learning, a natural, that is, a non-learned response to a natural stimulus starts being made to a new stimulus. This idea will be clarified in a moment. The natural or non-learned stimulus is called the unconditioned stimulus, abbreviated here as UCS. The natural response made to an unconditioned stimulus is accordingly called the unconditioned response, abbreviated as UCR. Evidence for what Pavlov called classical conditioning came from his classic experiments with a dog. To present this idea of classical conditioning in a schematic form, we are giving a more detailed description of the situation. Pavlov used a dog in his lab as he was working on salivary gland functioning in this animal. The unconditioned stimulus that was used in these experiments was food, and the unconditioned response to food was, of course, salivation. What Pavlov and his assistants in the lab noticed was that when a bell would be rung to indicate that food was arriving, the dog would show the salivary response even before the food actually appeared on the scene. So the new stimulus in this situation, namely the conditioned stimulus, was the bell, which was nothing at all like the natural stimulus called food, which should lead to a salivary response. However, when conditioning took place, the response that was initially made to food, namely the salivary response, now started being made to the new stimulus, namely the bell. The diagram that you see on the slide shows this relationship. So it can be seen that the UCS naturally, in an unlearned way, leads to the natural response called salivation. But when a new stimulus called bell is paired with the natural stimulus called food, and this happens on several occasions or trials, the UCR that was initially unnaturally made to food now starts being made to bell. The basic explanatory factor in this process was, according to Pavlov, contiguity or closeness in time. Several aspects and forms of this contiguity were described by Pavlov. We see here a schematic diagram of Pavlov's experimental setting. Details of this process called classical conditioning definitely deserve attention. Several sub-processes in classical conditioning need to be pointed out, as Pavlov had detailed in his propositions. The first process is called acquisition, which refers to that phase in classical conditioning in which the CR or conditioned response is acquired. The second sub-process is generalization, that is, when a response that is learned with reference to one stimulus, namely the first CS, in this case the bell, can actually be spread to another CS which is not at all like bell or the original CS. Along with generalization comes the third sub-process called discrimination, in which case the animal or the learner learns to distinguish between that CS that will lead to or will be followed by a particular UCS and one that will not be followed by that UCS. A fourth sub-process is called extinction, in which when the UCS repeatedly fails to appear after the CS, the CR, at least temporarily, disappears. What has been found in Pavlovian experiments is that following extinction, there is the fifth sub-process called spontaneous recovery, which refers to the recovery or reappearance of the learned CR after some time, even without the original acquisition or learning process. In addition to these sub-processes in classical conditioning, one also finds second order or higher order conditioning, so that in a stepwise fashion, when CS2 is paired with CS1, it starts eliciting CR1, and at the next higher stage, CS2 can then be paired with CS3 and so on, eliciting the same CR1. But this procedure can be taken only up to a limit. Examples of CS2, for instance, can be a light that is paired with CS1, which can be a sound such as a bell or a buzzer. Many years after Pavlov's basic classical conditioning theory was proposed, some other theorists came on the scene and proposed many changes along with alternative explanations for the basic process called classical conditioning. We will now describe each of the sub-processes that have just been listed. In the context of classical conditioning, acquisition is the phase during which the conditioned stimulus starts eliciting the conditioned response. In this phase, the strength of a CR is measured on the basis of something called the suppression ratio, which is essentially an indicator of the response rate to the CS. Two crucial factors in acquisition are A, repeated pairing of the CS with the UCS, and B, the time relationship between the components of classical conditioning, namely CS, CR, UCS, and UR. A major question in this context is, what is the sequence of events in classical conditioning? The answer to this query is that the sequence of appearance of the UCS, the UCR, CS, and the CR is important in classical conditioning, particularly because the time relationship, or what Pavlov called contiguity, was said to be a key factor in the process. This, of course, was Pavlov's view. Subsequently, however, various forms of classical conditioning, sometimes called procedures, were described, in which, as we shall see in a minute, the sequence may change slightly, but particularly the time relationship in these various forms of classical conditioning do differ. Let us take a look at these four procedures of classical conditioning, namely delayed conditioning, trace conditioning, simultaneous conditioning, and backward conditioning. Here is a schematic diagram that shows what happens in each of these forms of classical conditioning. You can see that in delayed conditioning, the CS comes on first, and after some time during which the CS is on, the UCS comes on. Both of these stimuli, that is the CS and the UCS, stop at the same time. Now, in the diagram, only one section has been shown, but in actual experiments of delayed conditioning, this sequence is repeated once again or several times over time. The second form, called trace conditioning, shows that the CS comes on for a while. When it stops, following the CS, after an interval, the UCS appears, during which the CS is not on. In other words, there is an interval between the cessation of the CS and the onset of the UCS. This interval is called the trace interval. In simultaneous conditioning, as the term itself depicts, the CS and the UCS are on simultaneously. In backward conditioning, which is probably the most puzzling form of conditioning, the CS actually comes after the UCS. Let us see each one of these forms of conditioning in slightly more detail in terms of procedure and sequence of events. In delayed conditioning, the CS appears and stays on. After a short interval, the UCS appears while the CS is still present. The CR, that is the conditioned response, should occur before the UCS appears in order to show that classical conditioning is taking place. In trace conditioning, the CS appears, stays on for some time and then goes away. After a short interval called the trace interval, the UCS appears and then goes away. The CR should occur after the CS and before the UCS. In the third form of conditioning called simultaneous conditioning, the CS and UCS appear and stop at the same time. If the CR appears after this phase, it is difficult to establish whether it was a response to the UCS or to the CS, because either of them could have been responsible for eliciting the conditioned response when the two stimuli are on simultaneously. In backward conditioning, the CS appears after the UCS. In this case, the CR in general would not be expected to occur. One interpretation of this form of conditioning is that the appearance of the CR or the CS indicates that the UCS has stopped, hence there is inhibition of the CR. However, in case by chance the CR appears, that would indeed be a puzzling case, because it would be very difficult to establish what the stimulus was for this CR to appear. In general then, out of these four forms of conditioning, simultaneous conditioning and backward conditioning are puzzling cases of classical conditioning. The typical case, however, can be found in delayed conditioning and to some extent in trace conditioning. Two special cases of classical conditioning also need to be mentioned here. And the first one of these special cases is temporal conditioning. By presenting the unconditioned stimulus at specified intervals, even without pairing it with any conditioned stimulus, it is possible to elicit a CR just before the US is to appear. It seems that time interval or time might itself act as a CS under some conditions. This seems to be similar to responding in terms of what is commonly called the biological clock. Therefore, if we are exposed to a situation where a particular event occurs at a specified interval, after a while we become so used to that exposed situation that we start expecting that event to occur, even if it is not paired with any other neutral stimulus like condition. The second special case is that of something called sensory preconditioning. Before the actual classical conditioning takes place, as in the conventional paradigm, suppose two neutral stimuli are paired together repeatedly. For example, a bell, which can be called CS1, and a light, which can be called CS2. Later, If one of these conditioned stimuli, say Bell, that is CS1, is paired with a UCS, say food, this CS will start eliciting a CR, say salivation. Now, without any new exposure, if CS2, that is light, is presented by itself, it also starts eliciting the CR, that is the salivary response. Clearly, the explanation for this would be that CS2, that is light, has been in the past associated with Bell even before the actual conditioning process took place, hence the term preconditioning. Sensory preconditioning suggests that time-based association or contiguity is definitely a major factor in classical conditioning. Some years later, research showed that mere contiguity, that is closeness in time, does not completely explain the process of classical conditioning. It seems to be a necessary but not a sufficient component of the process. The next two sub-processes mentioned on our list were generalization and discrimination. These are two sub-processes that have also brought up other issues relevant for the understanding of classical conditioning as a whole. The question that is to be raised in this connection is, once a particular CR is acquired with reference to a particular CS, is it possible that the same CR will be made to other stimuli that are similar to the first CS? The answer, as shown in research, is in the affirmative. Generalization refers to what can be called the spread of an acquired CR to other similar conditioned stimuli. One example could be that a CR is established with a bell having a particular tone. If the CS-UCS pairing is now done with another sound that has a similar, although not identical tone, the CR starts being elicited by the second sound, that is the CS2. Several real-life examples of generalization can be given. For example, many young children, toddlers for example, will run after any man that resembles their father, calling them daddy. It's only after this person turns around and shows some other stimulus features that the child himself or herself realizes that this person merely looks like his or her father, but is actually not the father. Discrimination can be considered the other side of the coin. This involves learning to respond with a particular CR only when a specific CS is present, but not when another CS is present. For example, the dog may show the CR when the CS is a bell of a particular tone only, but not when the CS is a buzzer and the second stimulus has not been associated with the UCS. Typically, this in fact is the procedure that is used to test discrimination. That is, the UCS follows only one of the two stimuli present in the situation and very systematically does not follow the other stimulus. The next process on our list is extinction, another extremely important process. Very briefly, extinction refers to the disappearance of a CR when the UCS does not appear. Recall the sequence of events in classical conditioning. The CS, that is bell, is followed by the UCS, that is food, and the CR, that is salivation, occurs after the CS. Pavlov observed that after the CR had been established, if over some trials the UCS does not follow the CS, the CR gradually fades away. This is called extinction. We have a question here. Does extinction mean that the CR is lost forever and cannot be recovered? The answer to this question is in the negative, as has been shown very clearly in several experiments. One answer to this question comes in the form of the next sub-process, which is called spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery is a sub-process which indicates that extinction is a temporary process. The word spontaneous in this term, it suggests that the CR, the conditioned response, is regained even without fresh acquisition or fresh learning. Thus, once a CR is acquired or learned, it will be made when the CS appears before the UCS appears. But if after some trials the UCS does not appear after the CS stops eliciting the CR. After a gap, the organism starts showing the CR again, but only under certain conditions. Such recovery of the CR can take place in more than one way. The first form is called reacquisition. Once the UCS is reintroduced into the situation after apparent extinction has taken place, this indicates that a recovery of a particular kind is possible. However, the rate of reacquisition of the CR is found to be faster than that during the original acquisition. The second kind of recovery is what is normally called spontaneous recovery. This takes place without reintroducing the UCS, but simply by presenting the CS again, of course after a gap in time. This kind of spontaneously recovered CR is usually weaker than the original CR. Some other forms of recovery have also been proposed. The question that needs to be raised here is, exactly what does this kind of recovery suggest? The answer could be, in a sense, a classically conditioned CR is not lost easily. Some researchers and experts in fact would suggest that something akin to memory is present when classical conditioning is taking place. Therefore, extinction is temporary unless there is no occasion at all for the CS-UCS association to be renewed. Pavlov provided neural explanations for all sub-processes of classical conditioning, including acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, as well as generalization and discrimination. Once again, we have a question. Is it necessary that the UCR in classical conditioning be a reflex response? In other words, is that a prerequisite for classical conditioning to take place? What other reflexes have been studied in addition to salivation? The answer that can be given here is that if the UCR is a reflex, it is easy to argue that the conversion of this UCR into a CR, or to use another familiar word, the substitution of this UCR by the CR is a process of learning. In other words, the role of learning is easier to bring into the picture if the initial response is a reflex rather than an earlier learned response. The term originally used by Pavlov was conditioned reflexes, although there is a slight debate with regard to the English meaning of the Russian word that Pavlov used. Non-reflexes, on the other hand, if present in the situation, may involve prior learning and, in one sense, confuse the effect of any new or pure classical conditioning. That is because reflexes are assumed to be biological in nature and are primarily non-learned responses. Some examples of other reflexes studied in the context of classical conditioning are withdrawal of a limb, for example, a paw among dogs or hooves among goats, in response to a mild electric shock. In human beings, eye blink as a response, a reflex response to a puff of air that is blown into the eye, is a reflex response that has been incorporated in some studies of classical conditioning. However, it is clear that classical conditioning can take place also in the case of responses that are not reflexes by themselves. Reflexes, on the other hand, may also involve some component of learning, as has been suggested by some experts. Moreover, many non-reflexes can be modified or classically conditioned through specific stimulus-stimulus associations. Examples of such cases can be found in cases of addiction and de-addiction. One of the techniques used for de-addiction, in fact, does involve principles of classical conditioning. Therefore, it is quite appropriate to refer to conditioned responses in the context of classical conditioning. What is being said then is that the fact that the UCR is a reflex is something that is a matter of convenience in terms of explanation, but it doesn't become a necessary condition or a prerequisite for classical conditioning as a process. We may raise a further question, and this one is in fact quite important. Is contiguity, as suggested by Pavlov, sufficient as an explanation for the whole process of classical conditioning? It has already been mentioned earlier that over the years following Pavlovian research, it was found that contiguity is probably a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one. Therefore, the answer to this query is largely in the negative. One major reply to this question, which took the whole theory of classical conditioning quite some strides ahead, is available in the Rescorla-Wagner model, proposed by Robert Rescorla and Alan Wagner. These two psychologists showed that other important elements provide more appropriate explanations for the basic process called classical conditioning. They moved away from the salivation experiment, which had made not just Pavlov famous, but the whole process called classical conditioning. Instead, these researchers examined fear conditioning, or what was called CER, conditioned emotional response. In fact, if one looks at the history of research on classical conditioning, some decades after Pavlov's work, one rarely finds the dog experiment or its parallel in classical conditioning research. According to the Rescorla-Wagner model, the key variable in classical conditioning was expectation. Here is the core explanation of the Pavlovian form of conditioning offered by these psychologists. After being exposed to repeated pairing of CS or bell with UCS or food, the dog showed the CR, that is the salivary response, because the CS, that is the bell, was a signal for the UCS, that is food, to appear. In other words, the CS made the animal expect the UCS. So here we have two major concepts, one that is called associative strength of the CS and the second one called contingency. The associative strength of a particular stimulus, for example the CS, would be important in predicting other stimuli that are connected with it, thereby affecting expectations of particular stimuli in any situation. Thus, when other stimuli normally associated with a particular stimulus appear, the organism is not surprised. This was also a term used by Rescorla and his associates. But in addition to expectation or lack of surprise, there has to be contingency, that is, a probability relationship between two stimuli, and it is this contingency that builds predictability of one based on the other. Evidence for these ideas was provided on the basis of experiments that showed the role of expectation, contingency, and predictability of the UCS by the CS. So, what is contingency in the context of classical conditioning? Very briefly, contingency in this context refers to the following: the probability of the occurrence of UCS given that the CS is present is not equal to the probability of the occurrence of the UCS given that there is no CS, or the probability that there is no UCS given that the CS is present. Specifically, the UCS will be predicted and expected only when the first probability, that is, the probability of the UCS given CS, is greater than the second one, that is, the probability of the UCS given no CS, or the probability of no UCS given CS. Another modification in the thinking about classical conditioning was brought in by Leon Kamin. Kamin's idea was that factors called informativeness and a process called blocking might come into the picture and change the whole process in major ways. Only conditioned stimuli that are informative with respect to predicting the UCS would actually elicit the CR based on classical conditioning. That is, if there are two CSs which have had prior association with a particular UCS, adding a new CS may have no learning effect, or at least no special learning effect, because the prior association may block the effects of the new CS. In other words, if the existing CS provides sufficient information about the UCS that is supposed to be coming, then there is no need for any other CS on the horizon. That is, any additional information would be redundant with respect to the prediction of the UCS. This was also illustrated through a series of very well thought out experiments. In sum, classical conditioning as proposed by Pavlov was extended much beyond the original conceptualization. This form of conditioning involves, number one, contiguity, that is, time-based association between CS and UCS, but also involves, number two, predictability and expectation of UCS on the basis of CS involving contingency, and third, informativeness of the particular CS with regard to the UCS. It is to be noted that the extensions made to Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning used terms such as expectation, prediction, signaling, surprise, attention, and information, all implying cognitive elements in the learning process. The description of the learning process, however, was still kept within the SR or stimulus response framework. Yet, cognitive concepts were not truly accepted by SR theorists, mainly because of the influence of the school called behaviorism. Although not all SR theorists are strictly speaking classified as behaviorists, all behaviorists were staunch supporters of the SR idea. Pavlov himself did not admit any such cognitive concept and used neurophysiological ideas for explanation. The modifications proposed by Rescorla, Kamin, Wagner, and their associates can be considered in a sense to be the beginning of the cognitive behaviorist movement that was in contrast to the radical behaviorism espoused by John Watson and the eminent behaviorist B. F. Skinner.